Long before foreign flags were planted on Philippine shores, before maps were redrawn and names rewritten, there were kingdoms that ruled, traded, worshipped, and warred across these islands, kingdoms whose names barely survive in classrooms today. Some were wealthy ports that rivaled regional powers. Others were river-based civilizations whose laws were carved into memory, not stone. Their rulers negotiated with Chinese emperors, Arab traders, and Southeast Asian kings. And yet, somehow, their stories faded, reduced to footnotes, or erased entirely. What happened to them was not a single event, but a slow disappearance, through conquest, colonization, neglect, and silence. To understand the Philippines today, you have to return to a time when these islands were not fragmented provinces, but powerful realms with identities of their own. The Philippines did not begin as a nation, but as a network of rivers, seas, and alliances. Water was a highway, not land, and whoever controlled trade controlled power. Gold flowed from the mountains of Luzon, pearls from the southern seas, spices from nearby islands, and ideas from across Asia. These were not isolated tribes waiting to be discovered, but organized societies with diplomacy, taxation, social classes, and warfare. Yet much of what we know comes from foreign records, Chinese merchants, Spanish chroniclers, Arab travelers. Because local histories were oral, vulnerable to being forgotten once the storytellers were gone. When colonizers arrived, they didn't just conquer land, they replaced memory. In doing so, entire kingdoms slipped into the shadows. One of the most powerful of these early realms was Tondo, a kingdom that thrived along the Pasig River centuries before Manila existed. Tondo was not a backwater settlement. It was a major trading hub, dealing directly with China as early as the 10th century. Its rulers, known as Locans, governed society structured by law, tribute, and honor. Chinese records mention Tondo's wealth and sophistication. Yet when the Spanish arrived, they labeled it merely as a barangay. By reducing a kingdom to a village, colonizers stripped it of legitimacy. Tondo did not fall in a dramatic battle. It was absorbed, renamed, and slowly erased, its royal bloodlines fading into ordinary surnames. Across the river stood Namayan, another powerful polity centered around what is now Santa Ana, Manila. Unlike Tondo's trade-focused identity, Namayan was deeply spiritual and agrarian, with strong ritual traditions tied to the river and land. Its rulers trace authority through both lineage and sacred duty. Spanish accounts barely mention Namayan, and when they do, it is already described as weakened, likely due to political pressure from Tondo and later Manila. But weakness does not mean insignificance. Namayan's disappearance is one of the clearest examples of historical erasure, a kingdom not defeated by war, but dissolved by shifting power, intermarriage, and colonization that found no need to preserve its name. Further north and across the seas, Chinese traders spoke of a land called Mai, a mysterious and wealthy kingdom believed to have existed in Mindoro or nearby islands. Mai was known for honesty in trade. Foreign merchants wrote that theft was almost unheard of there. It exported beeswax, cotton, pearls, and gold, and imported porcelain and silk. Yet no ruins clearly marked Maya's capital. No Spanish chronicler claimed it, and no modern city bears its name. Some historians argue Maya vanished due to shifting trade routes. Others believe it was absorbed by larger regional powers. What remains undeniable is this: Maya existed, thrived, and then vanished so completely that even its location is debated. In the Visayas, the kingdom of Cebu stood as a strategic maritime power long before Magellan arrived. Its ruler, Raja Humabon, was not a simple chieftain, but a seasoned diplomat navigating alliances and rivalries across the Central Islands. Cebu controlled regional trade and commanded warriors who enforced his authority. When Magellan arrived, he did not introduce power to Cebu. He inserted himself into an existing political struggle. The alliance with Humabon was tactical, not submissive. Yet history often remembers Cebu only as the place where colonization began, not as a kingdom that already understood power, negotiation, and war on its own terms. To the south, the kingdom of Butuan glistened with gold, literally. Archaeological finds reveal massive quantities of gold ornaments, boats, and tools, proving Butuan was one of the wealthiest pre-colonial societies in Southeast Asia. It built large balangay boats capable of open-sea voyages, connecting it to Borneo, Kampa, and beyond. Chinese records recognize Butuan as a sovereign state, not a colony or tribe. Yet its decline came quietly, likely due to changes in river systems and trade currents. When Spanish power expanded, Butuan was no longer dominant, making it easier to overlook. Wealth alone could not protect a kingdom once the world around it changed. The Sultanate of Sulu challenges the idea that all lost kingdoms vanished. Sulu survived, fiercely. It ruled an empire stretching from Mindanao to parts of Borneo, commanding trade routes and naval power for centuries. Its sultans negotiated treaties with Europeans as equals, not subjects. But colonial narratives later painted Sulu as a problem to be pacified, reframing a sovereign state as a rebellious region. Over time, borders shrank, authority weakened, and history books simplified its story. Sulu was not erased in fire. It was reduced through paperwork, treaties, and rewritten maps that ignored its former reach and influence. Equally powerful was the Sultanate of Maguindanao, a kingdom shaped by Islam, diplomacy, and resistance. It balanced internal governance with external threats, forging alliances while defending its autonomy against Spanish incursions. For centuries, Maguindanao remained unconquered, a fact often downplayed in mainstream history. Its rulers governed complex societies with legal systems, taxation, and military organization. But when colonial and later national narratives took shape, Maguindanao's story was framed as peripheral, southern, separate, difficult. The truth is more uncomfortable. Maguindanao did not fit the simplified story of colonization, so its strength was quietly minimized. These kingdoms were not myths, and they were not primitive. They were erased not because they were weak, but because remembering them complicates the story we were taught. A story where civilization arrived by ship, rather than already thriving by the sea. When history favors conquerors, silence becomes a weapon. What was lost was not just land or power, but identity, a sense that the Philippines once stood as many civilizations, not one unfinished one. And if these 7 kingdoms once existed, powerful and proud, then the question is no longer whether they were erased, but why we are only beginning to remember them now. The erasure of these kingdoms did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly through language, religion, and rewritten memory. When colonizers arrived, they did not simply destroy structures. They replaced belief systems, renamed places, and dismissed local rulers as lesser figures. Oral histories were labeled unreliable, while foreign accounts became official. Over generations, people stopped calling their ancestors kings and began calling them chieftains. Gold ornaments were melted down. Sacred sites were built over. The loss was subtle but devastating. A people who forget their past begin to doubt their worth. And in that forgetting, the grandeur of these kingdoms dissolve into myths, fairy tales, or footnotes buried deep in academic journals. What makes this loss even more tragic is that traces of these kingdoms still exist, hiding in plain sight. River names, family surnames, festivals, and rituals carry echoes of royal lineages and ancient laws. Some Filipino families unknowingly descend from ruling houses, their ancestry obscured by baptismal records that replace indigenous titles with Spanish names. Barangay boundaries often follow the same borders once defended by warriors. Even the way communities gather, negotiate, and celebrate reflects governance systems older than colonization. The past was never fully erased. It was layered over, like a city built atop another city. The foundations of these kingdoms remain beneath modern life, waiting to be acknowledged. The idea that pre-colonial Filipinos were disorganized or primitive persists because it serves a purpose. It justifies conquest. It frames colonization as rescue rather than invasion. But when you examine trade records, diplomacy, and warfare, a different image emerges, one of adaptability and intelligence. These kingdoms understood balance between land and sea, tradition and innovation, conflict and cooperation. They were not static societies frozen in time. They evolved constantly, Their leaders were strategists, not tyrants. Their people were citizens, not subjects. To recognize this challenges long-held assumptions and forces a reckoning with how history has been selectively remembered. Even religion played a role in this transformation. Indigenous belief systems were not replaced peacefully. They were labeled pagan and destroyed. Sacred groves became church plazas. Ancestral rituals were rebranded as superstition. Yet many traditions survived in disguise, woven into fiestas, prayers, and folklore. The kingdoms that once centered spirituality around nature and ancestry did not disappear. They adapted, but adaptation came at a cost. When belief systems change, so does identity. Over time, the names of gods were forgotten, and with them, the stories of societies that once honored them. Modern archaeology continues to challenge what textbooks once claimed. Gold artifacts in Luzon, shipwrecks in the Visayas, and ancient mosques in Mindanao all point to advanced civilizations with regional influence. But archaeology alone cannot restore what was lost. Without stories, artifacts become curiosities rather than proof of nationhood. This is why the rediscovery of these kingdoms matters, not as nostalgia, but as restoration. It reframes Filipinos not as passive recipients of history, but as active creators of it. The islands were never empty pages. They were already filled with ink before foreign hands tried to rewrite them. There is also a deeper emotional consequence to this erasure. When people are taught that their ancestors were conquered easily, they inherit a sense of smallness. But when they learn that those ancestors ruled seas, negotiated with empires, and resisted domination for centuries, something shifts. Pride replaces doubt. Curiosity replaces shame. The lost kingdoms of the Philippines are not just historical entities. They are reminders of potential. They show what Filipinos once built, and by extension, what they're still capable of building when they reclaim their narrative. Across the world, formerly colonized societies are re-examining their pasts, questioning who wrote their history and why. The Philippines is no exception. Scholars, artists, and storytellers are piecing together fragments, foreign records, oral traditions, archaeology, to reconstruct what was nearly forgotten. Each rediscovered detail is an act of resistance against centuries of imposed silence. Remembering these kingdoms does not divide the nation, it strengthens it. Unity does not require forgetting differences. It requires understanding how those differences once coexisted within complex systems of power and respect. The tragedy is not that these kingdoms fell. All civilizations rise and fall. The tragedy is that their stories were never allowed to be told fully. When a kingdom disappears from memory, its lessons disappear with it. Lessons about governance, sustainability, diplomacy, and resilience. In a modern world grappling with identity and direction, these lessons are more relevant than ever. The past is not dead weight. It is a compass, and the Philippines, long searching for its true historical north, may find it by looking further back than it was ever encouraged to go. So when we ask whether these civilizations were erased, the answer is both yes and no. They were erased from official narratives, from school books, from global recognition. But they were not erased from bloodlines, landscapes, or cultural memory. They survived in whispers, in stories told by elders, in patterns woven into cloth, in laws that echo ancient customs. The erasure was incomplete, and that incompleteness is an opportunity. Every retold story, every reclaimed name, every rediscovered site pulls these kingdoms back into the light. The 7 lost kingdoms of the Philippines were never truly lost. They were buried under centuries of forgetting. To remember them now is not to rewrite history, but to finish it, because the people who know where they came from cannot be easily told who they are. And perhaps the greatest legacy of these erased civilizations is this. They remind us that identity does not begin with colonization. It begins long before in rivers that carry gold, in seas ruled by ships, and in kingdoms that once stood proudly, waiting, even now, to be remembered. Thanks for watching.